The Cedar Fair Entertainment Company operates a little bit differently than the other major theme park chains. They don't have their name attached to all of their parks like Six Flags, Disney, or Universal, so they kind of fly under the radar, but you can identify their parks by the logo. It's the same font, along with the flag dotting the I's. Their closest competitor in the amusement park industry is Six Flags, since both chains appeal more to the thrill seekers than the families. And in a previous video, I talked about the Six Flags model and how they've become the discount chain of parks. Cedar Fair has a completely different business model, and some say it's better, but others would disagree. You be the judge. This is Cedar Fair, the haves and the have-nots. The Cedar Fair Company traces its roots all the way back to 1870, when Cedar Point opened as a recreational area and began to develop into an amusement park in the years to come. In 1978, Cedar Point acquired Valley Fair in Minnesota and decided they needed a name for this chain of amusement parks. Naturally, they combined their names of their two parks and came up with Cedar Fair, which became official in 1983. 9 years later, the company expanded by purchasing Dorney Park in 1992 and 3 years later acquired Worlds of Fun. In 1997, Cedar Fair purchased Knott's Berry Farm along with the Camp Snoopy Park at the Mall of America in Minnesota, but would withdraw from their lease with Camp Snoopy in 2005, allowing Nickelodeon to come in and rebrand the park as their own. 2001 saw the acquisition of Michigan's Adventure, and in 2004, Cedar Fair bought Worlds of Adventure off Six Flags' hands, though just 3 years later they would shut it down. The biggest move in Cedar Fair's history came in 2006 when they would outbid their competitors to acquire the 5 Paramount parks: Kings Island, Kings Dominion, Carowinds, Canada's Wonderland, and Great America, in a deal that also gave them Bonfante Gardens, later renamed Gilroy Gardens. So that's how Cedar Fair acquired its 12 parks. But for this video, I will leave out Gilroy Gardens since it's not on the level of the other 11 parks. You can really divide the Cedar Fair parks into 3 tiers: top, middle, and bottom. Or, to fit the theme of this video, the haves, the have-nots, and a few in the middle that could end up falling one way or the other. So let's start with the top tier and their flagship park, Cedar Point. This park is treated the best out of all the parks, and it should be. It's the only park in the chain that's a true multi-day destination park with an on-site hotel and has a different feel from other Cedar Fair parks. It's more of something you would find with Disney or Universal. They've gotten 3 major coasters since 2013. They did have a stretch between 2004 and 2012 where they only got 1 coaster, Maverick, and that can be explained away with the economic crash. But prior to that, they opened 3 Intaments in a 4-year span. Cedar Point is not in the most populated area. If you consider their base as the Cleveland and Columbus metropolitan areas, you're talking about 4.1 million people, which ranks it 7th among the 11 Cedar Fair park locations. But like I said before, it's a destination park, so people will travel to Sandusky specifically to spend a few days at this world-famous park, and it's in the upper tier in annual attendance, drawing in 3.6 million people, which ranks it 3rd in the chain. It's on a peninsula, so there's not much room for expansion, so they will have to get creative with the land they have, consider what they want to remove, and possibly think about building a parking structure to free up more space to keep attracting those big crowds. According to the United States SEC, through the end of 2016, they had developed 82% of their land, so this is a pretty big concern going forward. Cedar Point brings in about 22% of the chain's revenue as of 2015, which ranks it 2nd among all Cedar Fair parks. The next park on the haves list is just 3 hours down the road, Kings Island. At first glance, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to build up a park in a mid-sized city like Cincinnati, Ohio. But take a look at the metro areas that this park serves. Obviously, you have the 2.1 million people in the Cincinnati metro area who call this their home park. But 80 to 110 miles away, you also have Columbus, Indianapolis, Louisville, and Lexington, which brings the pool of potential park guests to 7.3 million, which ranks 4th in the chain. With the exception of Columbus, who can also turn north and go to Cedar Point, Kings Island is the best park for the people in these areas. Indianapolis has Indiana Beach and Louisville has Kentucky Kingdom, but neither are on the size or scale of Kings Island. Since Cedar Fair purchased Kings Island in 2006, they've given them 4 new coasters, soon to be 5 with the 2020 Giga Coaster. Not even Cedar Point can claim 5 new coasters since 2006. This is the most in the chain. This park also does very well in attendance, falling just short of Cedar Point with 3.5 million people annually, which puts it 4th in the chain and brings in 13% of Cedar Fair's revenue, which is the 3rd highest. One exciting thing about Kings Island is the amount of land they have to work with. As of 2016, they had only developed 49% of their land, and some of that was definitely used with Mystic Timbers and the new Giga Coaster. But there's still a lot of undeveloped land at Kings Island for Cedar Fair to keep growing this park as long as it keeps performing strongly. Let's take a look at park number 3 on the haves list, and that is Canada's Wonderland. This was also part of the big Paramount takeover in 2006, and they just opened their 4th coaster since the acquisition in 2019 in Yukon Striker. Right after buying the park, Cedar Fair put the wheels in motion for the B&M Hyper Behemoth, which opened in 2008, and followed that up with the first ever B&M Giga Leviathan. During the years where there was no coaster, the park got some outstanding flat rides. Before Cedar Fair, this park was full of mediocre or bad coasters, so Cedar Fair brought a completely different approach to the park than Paramount did. Canada's Wonderland sits 30 minutes north of Toronto, with 5.9 million people in its metropolitan area. Now, this is the biggest park in Canada, and it's a destination park for a lot of Canadians abroad. But there isn't really any other city nearby that I would consider part of the park's regular clientele. But Toronto alone puts this park 6th in the chain in terms of population. But this park brings in 3.8 million people annually, which puts it ahead of Cedar Point and 2nd place in the chain. It also brings in 9% of Cedar Fair's revenue as of 2015, which ranks it in a solid 4th place. One thing to consider is that this park is 100% developed. They have 0% undeveloped land, and the park is surrounded by residential and commercial areas. The parking lot is pretty massive, and it looks to be almost the same size as the park itself, so something can be done there. Or they will continue to find a way to work within the park itself like they did with Yukon Striker. The final park on the haves list is Carowinds, and this one is an interesting case. This is the 3rd park on the haves list that was acquired with the other Paramount parks, and it didn't take long before Cedar Fair started putting major attractions in. They started modestly enough with Carolina Cobra in 2009, the relocated boomerang from Geauga Lake. But then the next year they put in Intimidator, 5 years later was Fury 325, and then 4 years later was Copperhead Strike. Getting these massive additions on a 4 to 5 year timetable is a dream for most parks. But does Carowinds really deserve it? It's outside the top tier in attendance. And let me tell you that Cedar Fair does not publicize individual park performance, so it's hard to tell exactly where this ranks, but it's one of the 4 parks in the 2nd tier that get between 1.5 to 3 million guests a year. Carowinds brings in about 2 million people a year, and the Charlotte metro area only has about 2.5 million people, with no other major city nearby. So Carowinds ranks 9th out of the 11 parks in terms of population, and it only brings in 6% of Cedar Fair's revenue, which is tied for 5th place. So what does Cedar Fair see in this park that makes them want to invest so much into it? One factor is that the Charlotte metro area is experiencing the fastest growth in the entire country, and it has been over the last decade. Another factor is that Carowinds is the only major park within a 4-hour radius, so people coming to the Charlotte area will be enticed to make it a point to hit up this park with the world's tallest traditional Giga Coaster and all the other standout rides the park has to offer. Charlotte's population is also 4 years younger than the US average, so the people coming in are part of the more prime demographic to be interested in amusement parks. As for space, Carowinds has used 75% of its land. Okay, so that's the top tier. These 4 parks have come to expect a major addition every 3 to 5 years, and they know they'll be taken care of. Now let's look at the 3 parks in purgatory and see if they may be trending more towards the haves or the have-nots. Let's start with one I think is definitely headed into the haves, and that's California's Great America. Yet another Paramount park that joined the chain in 2006. It took a full 7 years before the first coaster came along, the terrific GCI Gold Striker in 2013. They converted the stand-up Vortex into the floorless Patriot in 2017, and in 2018 they received the RMC Raptor Railblazer. The rumor is that a B&M Hypercoaster will be coming to the park in the next couple years, and if that's the case, then there's no doubt that Cedar Fair sees potential in this park and are making a major push to make this park great. Great America is located in Santa Clara, which puts it in a prime location for the San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose metropolitan areas, which encompass 9.6 million people, which ranks the park 3rd in the chain in terms of population. There are also a lot of attractions in the Northern California area, but not much in terms of amusement parks. Great America really just has to compete with Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk and Six Flags Discovery Kingdom. Prior to 2013, I would argue that Discovery Kingdom was the best park in Northern California. But with Gold Striker and now Railblazer, Great America has easily overtaken Discovery Kingdom. Is it a coincidence that Cedar Fair started building this park up right as the San Francisco 49ers were building their new stadium literally across the street? The stadium definitely heightened the profile of the area, and it's good to see the park get some much needed attention. This park is the only one in the chain that leases the land it sits on, and it's the smallest park in terms of acreage. And by the end of 2016, they had developed 100% of their land. As for attendance, it's in the second tier, so it's pulling in 1.5 to 3 million guests, and as of 2015 accounts for 5% of the chain's revenue, which puts it tied for 7th. The next park in Purgatory is King's Dominion. Yes, another park that was previously owned by Paramount and then sold to Cedar Fair in 2006. After relocating Dominator from Geauga Lake in 2008, King's Dominion got a massive coaster during a time when it just wasn't happening for most other parks, Intimidator 305 in 2010. But then 8 years passed before they got their next coaster, the RMC conversion of Hurler into Twisted Timbers. These are great additions that the have-nots would never dream of getting, but the 8-year gap is something that the haves don't have to deal with. So what's the deal with King's Dominion? It sits in a great area near Richmond, Virginia, and it's accessible for the people of Richmond as well as the Washington, D.C. and Baltimore metropolitan areas. This accounts for 10.2 million people to draw from, which puts it in second place in the chain. Obviously, there are a ton of attractions in the D.C. area, so King's Dominion is not the only show in town, and they're also competing with a ton of parks nearby, specifically Busch Gardens Williamsburg just an hour away, as well as Six Flags America. And for those big population centers to the north, they may be attracted to Six Flags Great Adventure or Hershey Park. This is another park in the second tier of attendance, so they're getting between 1.5 to 3 million people a year. They're tied with Carowinds in bringing in about 6% of the chain's revenue, which is good for 5th place. Perhaps the most interesting thing about King's Dominion is that as of 2015, they've only developed 38% of their land. So if they decide to make a push to make this more of a destination park and draw in those huge population centers, they definitely have the land to do it. The final questionable park is another complicated case, and that's Knott's Berry Farm. Where to start with this park? It ranks number 1 in the chain in terms of population and attendance. Between the Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego metropolitan areas, you're talking about 26.3 million people. But they are obviously competing with a massive amount of attractions in Southern California outside of the amusement park industry. But within the industry, there's Magic Mountain, SeaWorld, Universal Studios, and the little park just 10 minutes down the road from Knott's, Adventure City. Oh, and Disneyland. Though I'm sure Disneyland actually helps their attendance since so many people come from all over the world to see Disneyland, and they could easily add Knott's to their vacation plans while they're in town. Knott's draws in 6 million people, which can be largely explained by the fact that it's open every single day except for Christmas. But it's still almost double the next highest park, Canada's Wonderland, which has less than 4 million people. Because of its operation schedule and extremely popular Knott's Scary Farm event in October, Knott's is number 1 in the chain, bringing in 23% of Cedar Fair's revenue. So why is this park in Purgatory if it's the top dog in population, attendance, and revenue? There are several explanations, but I think the most telling one comes from the SEC report from 2016. They have developed 100% of their land, and it's been this way for a long time. Knott's sits on a large city block and has zero room for expansion other than doing something in their parking lot. This is one of the reasons that their additions over the past decade have been a little weak. After they crammed Silver Bullet into the front of the park in 2004, they got compact family coasters with Sierra Sidewinder, Pony Express, and Coast Rider. The park finally got a major thrill coaster in 2018 with Hang Time, but it's still a very compact coaster because all they had was the tiny plot of land previously occupied by their Boomerang and Riptide rides. Knott's offers great thrill rides, but I wouldn't say it's their main objective. It's a true theme park, unlike the other parks in the chain, and a lot of their additions focus on family-oriented activities. I wouldn't say that Cedar Fair neglects Knott's, but it's just in a tough situation to get the expansion it deserves. And now for the have-nots. Let's kick this off with Dorney Park. It's been a tough decade. The only coaster they've gotten was a relocated inverted Boomerang, which was already removed. It's not in a bad spot, just an hour north of Philadelphia. So accounting for the Philly metropolitan area, you're looking at 6 million people, which puts it 5th in the chain. Obviously, people in Philadelphia are also very close to Six Flags Great Adventure and Hershey Park, so compared to those parks, Dorney lags far behind. But because of the population area, Dorney lands in the second tier of attendance with 1.5 to 3 million guests, the same range as Carowinds, King's Dominion, and Great America. It's also tied with Great America, bringing in about 5% of the chain's revenue as of 2015, which is tied for 7th place. So it seems like this park isn't doing badly, and given the population center nearby, it seems like maybe a better effort at expansion has the opportunity to pay off for the chain. So that's the case for Dorney Park. The other have-nots are in a more bleak situation. Let's go to Worlds of Fun. This park is located right in Kansas City, Missouri, and is the only park nearby for the 2.1 million residents in the metropolitan area, which puts Worlds of Fun at number 10 out of 11 in terms of population. This is the first park in this video to fall into the bottom tier of attendance, with 1 million or fewer guests per year. Worlds of Fun has also had a rough decade, with their last coaster being the GCI Prowler in 2009. They do bring in 5% of the chain's revenue, which is 7th alongside of Great America and Dorney Park, but given the population of the Kansas City metropolitan area and the attendance, I don't see Cedar Fair ever having the incentive to put anything major into this park, since it isn't likely to have a good return on investment. This will be a theme for the final 2 parks. Let's jump over to Valley Fair in the Minneapolis area. The Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul have 3.3 million people, which puts Valley Fair 8th on the population list, but it's stuck at the bottom tier of attendance with 1 million people or less annually. It also accounts for just 4% of the chain's revenue, which is good for 10th place out of 11. Their last major coaster came in 2007 with Renegade, so they're looking at one of the biggest droughts in the chain. Valley Fair has actually been consistently adding flat rides to their collection over the last 5 years, which are good, safe, low-cost additions to boost up a park with the potential like Valley Fair. Finally, let's talk about Michigan's Adventure. This park is in a horrible location. It sits just northwest of Grand Rapids, and that's the only city nearby. It's not too far from Chicago, but the park is not going to draw people from there with Six Flags Great America as their home park, and it's clear across the state from Detroit. The only coaster this park has received in the last 20 years is the relocated Vekoma SLC from Geauga Lake, Thunderhawk. Michigan's Adventure ranks dead last in population with 1.4 million people in the Grand Rapids area, and it's in the bottom tier of attendance with 1 million people or less, and contributes just 2% of the chain's revenue as of 2015. Cedar Fair clearly does not see that a major investment in the park would ever yield the return they can get from a more centralized park, and the track record of new coasters here shows. Of the 4 have-nots, land development does not seem to be a major issue. Dorney has developed 86% of their land, and Worlds of Fun has developed 71%, but the wide open spaces surrounding the park are very noticeable. Valley Fair has only developed 58%, and Michigan's Adventure has only developed 46%. Space is clearly not an issue here as it is at Knott's or even California's Great America. It just has to do with how much potential Cedar Fair thinks these parks have. And unless their surrounding cities have the type of growth that Charlotte has seen recently, it seems like these parks will always be doomed to be considered a have-not in the Cedar Fair chain. It makes sense to want to invest in a park to draw in bigger crowds, but it's rare to see a smaller park that desperately needs something new will ever get it, while the most popular parks are always getting the most attention. Unlike Six Flags, who will spread the wealth around to make sure each park gets a new attraction every year, Cedar Fair will concentrate its money on 1 or 2 major projects per year, which results in a much better ride, but also most parks being left in the dark. The chain is meticulous when it comes to where they decide to invest, and all that consideration has landed these parks into these 3 tiers. Let me know what you think about this video, and if you disagree with any of my assessments, and what the future holds for these parks in the Cedar Fair chain.